I'm Colleen Lavin. I'm a technical project manager at a company called Topcoder, and they're a crowdsourcing consulting company. Have to mention them because they paid to fly me across an ocean to talk about knitting. Go them. So, introduction, or why the heck are we talking about knitting at a tech conference? Well, there are two answers to that. The short answer is because the organizers said I could, and the long answer is that knitting is secretly technical. Of course, computers owe part of their origin to fiber arts in general. Some argue that the jacquard loom, that's the jacquard loom, is the original computer, and that the earliest programmers were the people who made patterns they made the punch card patterns for weaving. And the jacquard loom is controlled by wooden punch cards that determine which cords of fabric should be raised. So that tells the loom what to do. And besides that, there are a lot of similarities between knitting and coding. First of all, they both take input. For knitting, it takes yarn, and for coding, it takes all sorts of things. That's just a picture of a React input library. And both produce output. For knitting, you're basically following a binary set of instructions to produce a 3D output. Usually a scarf, something else. I usually just make scarves. I'm not very good at knitting yet. And for programming, it makes a program, or in my case, a lot of bugs. Knitting patterns are also kind of code in disguise. So here's a knitting chart all the way to the left. That's it written out. And there's it written as a program. It is basically a while loop. You do this thing over and over while this condition, or while the stitches remaining are greater than 1. And there are also a few other similarities between knitting and coding. First, they are both highly mathematical, which is kind of counterintuitive. But one quote that I really like about this is from Elizabeth Zimmerman's Knitter's Almanac. And that's about the mathematics of increases while knitting a circular shawl. And the quote is, "Have you begun to see the well-known geometric theory behind what you've been doing? It's pi, the geometry of a circle, hinging on the mysterious relationship of the circumference of a circle to its radius," which is a pretty cool way to describe making a shawl in my mind. Other similarities, they're both easy to get started, but take a lot of practice to get good. It's pretty easy to make a scarf, or to get any language to say hello world in less than 5 minutes. But it takes a lot of practice to actually understand what you're doing, or to write your own patterns or write your own code without Googling everything. Or even once you know it, you do usually end up for both things, Googling everything. They're also both kind of seen as supremely difficult to the point of magic to outsiders. I don't know how many of you in the room knit, but if you show up somewhere and tell someone that this scarf or this hat was something you just made while watching TV or being on conference calls, they look at you and say something along the lines of, "Wow, I wish I could do that," or "Wow, that's something I could never do." And that's kind of the same when you show them a program or a website or some robot that you've made not run into things. But counterintuitively, they're both simultaneously undervalued. A lot of people ask knitters, or really artists of any kind, to give them their work for free. Like, "Oh, you just made this hat. That just took your time, so can I have it for free? Can I have it for $5? So not taking into account the amount of work taken, talking is hard, not taking into account the amount of hours needed to produce that. And of course, all the developers in the room, if you've tried to freelance, or if you've just mentioned you're a programmer, someone will probably come up to you and say that they could handle the business side if you do all of this work for free. There are a few Facebook groups with memes dedicated to that I highly recommend. Other than that, you can make cool things with both of them. For both, you often pretend that bugs are features. I have a hat that I ran out of one type of yarn, so the part where that's how I tell what the back is and what the front is. It's the part where the yarn is slightly off. It's totally a feature. You need that in a hat, obviously. And I don't need to give examples for code. All of you have one in your head right now. And both use test-driven development, knitting patterns in code developed over time and tested out over and over. So now that we've established that knitting is technical, we're going to talk about how knitting has been used for espionage. So, as with many historically female activities, knitting was often seen as harmless. And I'm sure that everyone here knows that being underestimated is one of the greatest tactical gifts that someone can give you. It is a great advantage if you're seen as this weak little woman when you're at war against someone. And since knitting and other textiles are women's work, they've been used as tools of espionage for many, many years. In fact, they've been used since the Revolutionary War in the United States. So longer than my country has been a country, knitting has been used in war. So, Molly Rinker in the Revolutionary War used a ball of yarn to pass information to rebel troops. And now how this happened was British troops took over many homes in the colonies. Molly Rinker of Philadelphia, her house was taken over by troops that took over the dining room and all of the living quarters and talked strategy in there. Now, of course, they banned the men from going into these rooms, but Molly, a meek little woman, she had to serve them their food there. And surely she couldn't understand what they were saying. So they talked strategy around her. Molly went out, wrote all of their decisions down, put it on a rock, wrapped that rock with a ball of yarn, went out to the woods and for her knitting. While she was there, she would pass the secret yarn ball, the yarn ball of secrets, to the revolutionary troops, to George Washington's men, and they would pick it up and continue using that information. Now, of course, that doesn't actually involve knitting. I just really like that story. But where knitting's actually used in espionage, one great example, actually many great examples, can be found in World War II. So during World War II, the Belgian resistance specifically recruited women who lived near railway yards. They tracked German train movement by knitting. So you purl for one type of train, and then you drop a stitch for another. The Office of Censorship banned people from setting knitting patterns abroad, and the UK banned all printed knitting patterns out of fear they were being used for intel. Because this was an easy thing because knitting is binary. There are two main stitches, knit and purl. Better knitters than me have fancy techniques, but those are the main ones. It makes it super easy to translate to Morse code or any other code, not any other code, but another code, and hide in, say, a scarf or a sock. And since knitting patterns look like code, once you know code, you can read code, in theory. So here is actually a pattern I found online of that it hides Morse code into a scarf, and it's really cool to me, at least. And anyway, moving on from espionage, knitting's also, in this day and age, been used a little bit for demonstration of AI. And this is a project called SkyKnit. So in 2017, she started this project. In 2018, she released it. But research scientist Janelle Shane, who is a researcher who uses neural nets for comedy, she trained a neural net on a series of knitting instructions. The project, which was originally called Project Hilarious Disaster, used what it learned to start creating patterns of its own and posted them to the knitting site Ravelry. Now, quick sidebar, Janelle Shane, if you follow weird neural net humor, you've probably seen some of her work. She made neural net generated candy hearts and neural net generated Halloween costumes too. I'm partial to the suggestions Punk Tree and Disco Monster, but if I read all of the really good ones, we'd be here all day, and I don't think the conference organizers would like that. But anyway, back to SkyKnit, which is what the community members renamed Project Hilarious Disaster on Ravelry. They got really into it. So one thing that happened with SkyKnit was something that Janelle Shane didn't really predict when she posted the patterns. People started knitting them. So people would take these patterns, and Janelle Shane, who isn't a knitter, would post them. And one quote that I really liked from her was that she wouldn't, and actually this isn't a quote, this is a paraphrase, but she wouldn't fully understand the patterns, and she'd have people come up to her and say, "This is the funniest joke I've ever read," because the neural net didn't get the full logic of humanity or the full way knitting works in general. So you'd get these ridiculous things because people knitted them, and then they kept knitting them, producing these ridiculous and kind of joyful creations. It went on for a while, and there were thousands of people who participated in this. And that is the end. Any questions? All right, great. I have my references if anyone needs, and this will be online if anyone needs to see it. Thank you.